Mark had worked at the Community Arts Center for almost 5 years, and in all that time, hardly anyone ever stopped to really look at him. He wore the same faded blue uniform every day, pushed the same squeaky cleaning cart down the same long hallways, and wiped the same dusty stage floors before and after every show. To most people, he was invisible. When performers rushed past him, they would sometimes say, "Thanks," but they never waited to hear if he replied. When audience members saw him, they simply stepped aside and kept talking, as if he were part of the furniture or a moving shadow passing by. And Mark never complained, because he wasn't the kind of man who sought attention anyway. What most people didn't know, what no one ever cared to ask, was that Mark was not just a janitor. He was a single father doing his best to raise his daughter Lily. He worked 2 jobs, slept too little, and spent most of his money on her school fees, her meals, and the little things that made her happy. Every morning he woke up at 5, made breakfast for them both, walked her to school, and then hurried to his cleaning shift. Every evening he picked her up, helped with homework, and tucked her into bed with a kiss before returning to the art center for the night rotation. It was exhausting, but he never let himself complain. Being there for his daughter was more important than anything else. The irony was that the place he worked, the big stage, the shining lights, the grand piano resting under a velvet cover, used to be part of his dreams. When he was younger, he had imagined himself on a stage like this, not cleaning it, but performing on it. But life had changed for him too fast and too painfully. Now when he swept the floor or polished a piano bench, he did it quietly, trying not to remember the past. The performers who rehearsed on stage had no idea that the man mopping near them once knew more about music than some of them ever would. They didn't know that his hands, now rough from cleaning chemicals, had once been praised for their graceful touch on piano keys. But even if the world didn't notice Mark, Lily did. She would often watch him work, sitting in a corner of the auditorium while he swept. Sometimes she brought her drawing book. Sometimes she played quietly on her small tablet. And sometimes she simply watched her father with admiration in her eyes, because in her heart, he was not invisible at all. He was the strongest, kindest man she knew. When people walked past him without seeing him, she felt a tiny sting inside. But she also felt proud knowing that her father had a talent no one else knew about. On this particular evening, the Arts Center was busier than usual. Performers rushed around preparing for a big talent showcase. The backstage buzzed with chatter, makeup brushes, warm-up sounds, nervous laughter, and the clicking of shoes. The audience slowly filled the seats, excited for the show. In the middle of all this movement, Mark pushed his cleaning cart toward the stage. He worked carefully, making sure every corner of the wooden floor shined. While he worked, people crossed the stage, stepped over his mop, and carried props around him. He didn't get in their way, and they didn't stop to recognize him. For them, he was simply the man whose job it was to make everything clean before they took their spotlight. One performer accidentally bumped into him as she rushed by, dropping a few sheets of music onto the floor. "Oh, sorry," she mumbled, quickly gathering the pages without looking him in the eyes. Mark gave a small nod, even though she didn't notice. He wasn't offended. He was used to it. Being overlooked had become part of his life, and he accepted it, like he accepted the long hours and the heavy buckets. But inside Mark, there was still a small spark, a part of him that had never completely died. When he passed the piano, he sometimes paused for a second, just long enough to remember what it felt like to play. He never dared lift the cover and touch the keys during working hours. That wasn't his place anymore, he told himself. He belonged on the sidelines now, not on the stage. Yet the spark remained, quiet but alive, waiting for a moment he couldn't yet imagine. On nights like this, when the stage lights glowed and the auditorium filled with warm laughter and excitement, Mark felt something shift inside him. It was as if the place whispered memories back to him, soft reminders of who he used to be and who he still might be, deep down. But then someone would call him to clean something, and the moment would fade. He would return to his work, the unnoticed man with the mop in his hand and a world of unspoken stories in his heart. Mark's past was something he carried quietly, like a folded letter he never opened, but could never throw away. People saw only the tired single father who cleaned floors for a living, but they didn't know that his life had once looked completely different. Before he became a janitor, before life forced him into endless night shifts and early mornings, Mark had been someone full of dreams. And at the center of those dreams was a piano. As a teenager, he used to spend hours sitting in front of an old upright piano in his grandmother's house. The wooden keys were worn, some slightly chipped at the corners, but to Mark, they looked like magic. Music was the one thing that made him feel understood without needing words. Whenever he felt lonely, the piano became his friend. Whenever he felt lost, the piano became his direction. Even when he played for no one except the quiet walls, he played with passion, imagining a future where he would perform on bright stages for crowds who truly listened. He worked hard too. While other kids played outside, Mark practiced for competitions. While others slept late on weekends, he traveled to small events where he sat nervously on polished benches, waiting for his turn to play. And every time he placed his fingers on the keys, something inside him came alive. Judges noticed. Teachers noticed. Strangers noticed. They called him gifted, special, someone with a real chance to go far in the music world. But as Mark got older, life unfolded in unexpected ways. When he was 19, he met a girl named Ava. She wasn't a musician, but she had the gentleness of someone who could hear emotion even in silence. She listened to Mark talk about music with such warmth that he felt braver around her than anyone else. Their friendship grew into love, a quiet, beautiful one that made him feel like he could handle anything that came his way. They planned everything together. Mark wanted to apply to a well-known music academy, and Ava supported him. She wanted to study early childhood education. They dreamed of a small apartment, maybe a piano near the window, simple dinners, and soft music filling the rooms. But life, as it often does, had different plans. When Ava found out she was pregnant, Mark wasn't scared. He was excited. He pictured himself teaching their baby lullabies on the piano, imagined little hands reaching for keys, imagined family moments full of love. They were young, and the world was rough, but they were ready to make it through together. But just months after their daughter, Lily, was born, Ava became very sick. At first it seemed like something small, something that would get better with time. But instead of improving, her condition worsened. Doctors tried. Mark prayed. Ava stayed brave through it all. But life, once again, was unfair. She passed away quietly one rainy evening, leaving Mark holding their infant daughter in his shaking arms. Unsure how he would survive a world suddenly too big and too empty. That night, something inside Mark changed. The music that once lived in his heart dimmed. He couldn't bring himself to touch a piano. Every note reminded him of the life he lost. So he packed away his sheet music, closed the lid of the piano at his grandmother's house, and walked away from the dream he had once built his whole world around. His only focus became Lily, feeding her, keeping her warm, rocking her to sleep, whispering promises to her that he wasn't sure he could keep. He needed a stable job, something safe, something with regular pay, and the opportunity at the community arts center came at the perfect moment. It wasn't glamorous, but it meant food, rent, and a chance to be close to the place where music still lived. Maybe a small part of him hoped that being near music again would comfort him. But instead, he kept his distance. He kept his head down. He swept the floors and cleaned the seats while pretending he didn't feel the pull of the piano on the stage. Over the years, the workers at the center never guessed that the quiet janitor used to play with such emotion that people cried. They didn't know that the man wiping dust from the stage once dreamed of standing on it. They didn't know he avoided touching the piano because he was afraid the music would remind him too much of what he lost. But Lily knew. Even when she was little, she sensed that her father was more than he claimed to be. She saw the softness in his eyes whenever he glanced at a piano. She noticed the way his fingers twitched slightly when he walked past it, as though his hands remembered something he tried so hard to forget, and though Mark believed that part of his life was gone forever. Fate was slowly preparing a moment, one unexpected moment that would bring his lost music back to him in the most surprising way. The night of the talent showcase arrived with more excitement than usual, and the entire art center buzzed like a busy beehive. Posters were taped on every door, spotlights moved across the stage, and performers rushed around practicing last-minute dance steps or warming up their voices. It was the kind of lively chaos that made the place feel alive. And right in the middle of all this movement was Mark, pushing his old cleaning cart toward the stage as he always did. Unnoticed by almost everyone, but tonight was different for Mark, not because of the show, but because he had brought Lily with him. Normally, he left her with a neighbor when he had late shifts, but the neighbor had an emergency, and Mark didn't want to burden anyone else. So Lily came along, holding his hand tightly as they walked into the glowing auditorium. Her eyes widened the moment she saw the colorful lights and decorations. To her, the place felt magical. To Mark, it felt like a reminder of everything he had once loved and lost. But he smiled anyway. For Lily's sake, he found a seat for her at the side of the auditorium, where she could see the stage without getting in anyone's way. She swung her feet excitedly, holding a small snack he had packed for her. She loved show nights. She loved watching dancers twirl like butterflies and singers taking deep breaths before brave notes. But the thing she loved most was simply being near her father, even if he was working. As she settled in, Mark walked toward the stage with his mop and cloths. The stage floor needed to be spotless before the audience entered. Performers rushed past him with costumes made of sparkles, feathers, and stiff fabric that swished loudly. One boy practiced juggling backstage, dropping balls every few seconds. A choir hummed warm-up notes. A young girl rehearsed her violin, hitting a few sharp sounds that made the lighting crew wince. Everywhere around him, people prepared for their moment under the spotlight. Mark, however, worked quietly, blending into the background like he always did. But something small and unexpected happened that evening. As Mark wiped the stage, his eyes drifted toward the grand piano resting near the center. The light above it made the polished surface shine like glass. For a moment, just a tiny moment, Mark felt a familiar tug in his chest. The same tug he had tried to ignore for years. He swallowed hard and forced himself to continue cleaning. He reminded himself that his job was to prepare the stage, not dream about being on it. But Lily didn't miss that little pause. From her seat, she watched him with curious eyes. She had grown old enough to understand her father's silent moments, those moments when his breathing slowed, and his eyes softened as if he were remembering something from long ago. She followed his gaze to the piano and felt a quiet excitement bloom inside her. She didn't know everything about her father's past, but she knew enough. Her dad once played the piano beautifully. She knew because she had caught him once years ago, playing softly in their small apartment while he thought she was asleep. She had never forgotten that moment. Meanwhile, backstage, someone shouted for a broom, and Mark hurried over, mopping up a small spill left by one of the dancers. He moved with practiced speed, calming the frustrated stage manager with a gentle nod. He never spoke more than necessary. His quiet nature sometimes made people assume he wasn't confident, but the truth was that he didn't want to disturb anyone. He was simply used to a life where being unnoticed felt safer. Once he finished his tasks, Mark returned to the stage to reposition the piano slightly, just as the organizer requested. As he placed his hands on its polished wooden edge, he felt the smooth texture under his fingers. Without meaning to, He let one finger slide across the surface until it touched the cold metal of a key. The sound of that single note was soft, barely noticeable, but it echoed inside him like a memory waking up. A few audience members' early arrivals glanced up briefly, wondering who had touched the piano. But they quickly returned to their conversations. Mark took a small step back, almost embarrassed. He wiped the front of the instrument gently, trying to hide the fact that the single note had shaken him more than it should have. His chest felt tight, and he didn't know why the simple sound made him feel so alive and so sad at the same time. Lily watched him, her heart beating a little faster. She knew something was happening inside her father. Something he couldn't say out loud. And although Mark didn't realize it yet, this was the night everything would begin to change. The stage he always cleaned was slowly becoming the place where his past and future would meet. The piano he tried so hard to avoid would soon pull him into a moment he never expected. A moment that would surprise everyone, including himself. The talent showcase had officially begun, and the audience seats were now filled with families, friends, and excited locals. The sound of clapping, cheering, and whispered conversations floated through the auditorium like gentle waves. Mark continued his work quietly at the edges of the stage, moving out of sight whenever a performer stepped under the bright lights. He was used to being invisible, and he didn't mind it, at least, that's what he told himself. But something unusual happened during one of the short breaks between performances. The stagehands were late in bringing out the next props, so there was a sudden awkward pause. The audience murmured, expecting something to happen. The host rushed backstage to check what was wrong. Meanwhile, the grand piano sat right in the middle of the stage. Shining like a silent invitation, Mark was asked to wipe the surface of the piano and make sure the bench was in the correct position, because the next performer was a young pianist scheduled to come up soon. He nodded politely and stepped onto the stage, completely unaware that dozens of eyes were drifting toward him simply because he was the only one moving. He walked the way he always did, quiet, calm, slightly hunched, as though he was trying to take up as little space as possible. He ran his cloth across the piano gently, polishing the dark wood until it reflected the stage lights. As he worked, the auditorium slowly fell quieter. People in the front rows leaned forward without realizing it, curious. It wasn't because he did anything special, it was simply because nothing else was happening on stage at that moment. And for once, people actually noticed him. To the audience, it looked like a simple task. But to Mark, it was something deeper. Every time he touched the piano, even lightly, a small current ran through him. It felt like touching a forgotten part of himself, a part he had sealed away long ago. He tried to work quickly, before any memories could rise up and make his chest heavy again. When he finished polishing the top, he adjusted the piano bench. The legs wobbled slightly, so he crouched down to fix it. As he stood back up, his fingertips brushed against the keys, not on purpose, just a gentle accident. But even that slight touch produced a soft, delicate note that drifted into the air like a breath. The sound was tiny, almost nothing. But for some reason, a few people in the audience looked up. A woman in the third row paused mid-sentence. A teenager who had been scrolling on his phone lifted his eyes. A small child sitting on her mother's lap pointed toward the stage, whispering, "Someone's playing the piano." Mark froze for a second, embarrassed. He hadn't meant to play anything at all. It was just a slip of the fingers. But that one tiny sound seemed to awaken something around him. Something he couldn't see but could feel like invisible eyes paying attention to him in a way he wasn't used to. He quickly moved his hand away, pretending nothing happened. He finished adjusting the bench and stepped aside, so the technical crew could set up microphones. But the moment wasn't over yet. From her small seat near the side of the auditorium, Lily watched her father with shining eyes. She saw the way he stiffened when he accidentally touched the key, and she recognized the look on his face, a mixture of surprise and longing. She knew that look. She had seen it before, the first time she heard him play at home. Back then, he had tried to hide his emotions, but she could still see them slipping through the cracks. This time, she whispered softly to herself, "He misses it." Meanwhile, backstage chaos continued. The next performer had misplaced her sheet music and was running around nervously. The host tried to joke with the audience to buy time, but the sound system crackled loudly, causing a short burst of feedback that made people wince. Technicians scrambled to fix the microphones, waving for someone to stall a little longer. Mark had finished his task and wanted to move off stage, but one of the stagehands gestured for him to wait. They needed him to stay nearby in case something needed cleaning or adjusting. So he remained standing beside the piano, quietly, almost like a shadow. The audience, still waiting for the next act, continued to watch him simply because he was the only steady presence on stage. Some people whispered to each other, curious about the quiet janitor who looked surprisingly comfortable near the piano. They didn't know anything about him, but something about his calm posture and the way he'd touch the keys, even accidentally felt different. It was the first time in years that people actually looked at Mark, not as a cleaner or a background worker, but as a human being, someone mysterious, someone who didn't fit the role they assumed he played. And yet, even with all those eyes on him, Mark had no idea that the moment he touched that single piano key was the beginning of something extraordinary. Something that would soon reveal the part of him he thought was gone. The break between performances stretched longer than expected, and the audience grew restless. Whispering filled the room like soft wind, and a few people checked their watches. The stage crew hurried around backstage trying to fix the microphone issue, but nothing seemed to work. For the first time that evening, the bright stage lights shone not on a performer, but on Mark, still standing quietly beside the piano, waiting for instructions. Lily watched him with growing excitement. She could sense that something was different about her father tonight. He wasn't rushing off the stage yet. He wasn't hiding behind the curtains. He stood there, close to the piano, close enough that the keys almost seemed to call his name. She slid off her seat and walked closer, keeping to the side so she wouldn't get in the way. Her tiny footsteps echoed softly on the polished floor. When she reached the edge of the stage, she whispered his name, "Dad." Mark turned and saw her looking at him with her usual warm eyes. He smiled softly, even though his heart felt tight from the strange attention. He walked over, crouching down so she could hear him. "Shouldn't you be sitting, sweetheart? The show will start again soon." Lily shook her head a little, her eyes shining with a mix of excitement and courage she didn't usually show. "Dad, I saw how you touched the piano key." Mark's smile faltered. His breath paused for a second. "It was an accident," he whispered, trying to keep his voice steady. "But you looked happy," Lily said gently. Just for a moment, Mark didn't know how to respond. Happy wasn't a word he used for himself. He felt tired, responsible, sometimes proud when Lily laughed, but happy? He had forgotten what that felt like. Before he could speak, Lily reached out and took his hand. Her small fingers squeezed his gently. "Dad, you should play." Mark's eyes widened as panic rushed through him. His heart thumped so loudly it felt like it echoed in his ears. "Play?" he repeated, almost in disbelief. "Lily, I can't. This isn't my time. I'm just the janitor. People didn't come here to listen to me." Lily shook her head again, more firmly this time. "You're not just anything. You're my dad. And you play better than anyone here." Her words hit him straight in the heart. They were simple, innocent, but powerful in a way only a child's honesty could be. She had no idea how deep those words reached, how they touched a part of him he had kept buried for years. He let out a slow breath, trying to steady himself. "Sweetheart, even if I wanted to, I shouldn't. This is for the performers. They've practiced. They've worked hard. I can't take their moment." "But you're not taking anything," Lily whispered. "The stage is empty. Nobody's coming yet. And people are already watching you." Her gaze flicked briefly toward the audience. Mark followed it and felt his stomach tighten. She was right. Many people were looking his way, not rudely, not critically, but with curiosity, as if they were waiting for something. Waiting for him. He shook his head, overwhelmed. "They're only watching because nothing else is happening. As soon as someone comes out, they won't care about me." Lily thought for a moment. Then she said something that almost made him lose his breath completely. "Mom would want you to play." Mark's heart felt like it suddenly cracked open. He hadn't heard Ava's name spoken in that way for a long time, not gently, not lovingly. He closed his eyes for a second, trying to keep his emotions from pouring out. When he opened them again, Lily was still holding his hand, her expression soft but determined. "You always tell me to be brave," she whispered. "Maybe now it's your turn." Those words settled deep inside him. They didn't push him, they invited him. Invited him to remember who he used to be. Invited him to let go of fear for just one moment. Invited him to believe that he was more than the uniform he wore. Behind them, a stagehand called out in frustration as the microphone crackled again. The host apologized to the audience for the delay. The crowd murmured impatiently. The stage lights continued to shine on the empty space, making the piano glow as if it were waiting. And Mark realized something. For the first time in years, he didn't want to run from the piano. He wanted to go to it. Slowly, he turned back toward the instrument. His footsteps were hesitant, but pulled by something stronger than fear, pulled by memory, by love. By the voice of the little girl who believed in him more than he believed in himself. He didn't know if he would actually play. He didn't know what would happen. He only knew one thing. Lily was right. Maybe tonight. Courage belonged to him. Mark stood beside the piano, unsure if his legs were shaking from nerves or from the weight of everything that was happening. The crowd was restless. The host was trying to fix things backstage, and the stage lights were far too bright for someone who never expected to stand in them. He felt exposed, like every breath he took was being watched. But behind him, Lily's small voice echoed inside his heart, giving him strength he didn't know he still had. He placed one hand on the piano bench, not sitting yet, just touching it, testing the moment. The polished wood felt smooth under his fingers, warmer than it should have felt. It almost felt alive. The piano seemed to be waiting for him, as if it had known him long before this night, long before his life had fallen apart. The audience didn't fully understand what was happening. Some thought he was checking the bench because the next performer was late. Others whispered things like, "Is the janitor fixing something? And why is he still on stage?" But even those confused whispers slowly faded as people realized he wasn't moving away. He was moving closer. Mark didn't decide suddenly. It wasn't a bold jump. It was a slow, quiet awakening. A part of him that had been asleep for years was stretching, breathing again. His fingers brushed the piano keys lightly, almost afraid to wake the memories behind them. He let one key fall under his touch. A soft, clean note floated into the air. The audience went silent, not because it was spectacular, but because it was unexpected. A moment they weren't prepared for. A man they had overlooked all evening was now standing in the center of the stage, touching the piano as though it meant something. And even though the note was simple, something about the way he played it felt different. Backstage, the technician shouted, "We need more time. Just stall somehow." The stage manager peeked out, ready to wave at Mark to step aside, but then she froze. There was something in the way he stood that made her pause. Something gentle. Something emotional. Something that didn't feel like a man stalling for time, but someone stepping into a part of himself he had lost. Mark took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and slowly sat down on the bench. The murmurs in the audience stopped instantly. Every sound, every whisper, every cough faded. Even Lily held her breath, her hands pressed against her chest. She could feel the air change around her, like the room itself was waiting. Mark lifted his hands to the keys. They hovered there, trembling slightly. He hadn't played for years. He was afraid his fingers wouldn't move the way they used to. Afraid the sound would come out wrong. Afraid the pain of remembering his old dreams would drown him. But when he finally pressed the keys, just softly, gently, something opened inside him. Music. Not the kind of music you hear in competitions or fancy concerts. This was different. This was raw, fragile, and deeply human. He began playing a melody he wrote long ago, before Lily was born, before Ava got sick, before life had taken everything from him. It was a melody filled with stories he never told anyone. The notes drifted into the air like soft falling snow. They were full of sadness at first, quiet but deep, carrying the weight of his years of loss. But then the melody shifted, turning warmer, brighter, as if hope were slowly pushing its way into the darkness. The audience stared, stunned. Some leaned forward, not wanting to miss a single sound. A few people put their hands over their hearts. A couple of teenagers lowered their phones slowly, forgetting to record. Even the children who had been fidgeting earlier sat completely still, mesmerized. Backstage, the host stopped complaining about the broken microphone. The stage crew froze in place. The violin girl who had been crying over her lost sheet music wiped her eyes, unsure why she suddenly felt emotional. And in the middle of it all was Mark playing like he wasn't a janitor, wasn't a tired father, wasn't a man weighed down by grief. He was simply a musician, a soul speaking in notes rather than words. His fingers moved faster now, remembering the way they used to dance. He didn't think about the audience. He didn't think about the consequences. He didn't think about fear. He thought only about the music, the way it poured from him as naturally as breathing. When he reached the last part of the melody, a part that he had once written for Ava's eyes burned. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming feeling of being alive again. He played those final notes with his whole heart, letting every memory, every love, every loss out through the keys. When the last sound faded, the silence in the auditorium was almost thick enough to touch. And then, for the first time in his life, Mark heard something he never expected to hear again, a rising wave of applause. Not polite applause, not confused applause, a roar of claps, cheers, and gasps from hundreds of people who had just witnessed something genuine and extraordinary. Mark lifted his trembling hands from the keys. Unable to speak, unable to breathe, he had just stepped back into the world he once lost, and nothing would ever be the same again. The applause rose like a wave and crashed over the entire auditorium, but Mark sat frozen on the piano bench, unable to move. His heart pounded so loudly that it almost drowned out the sound. Almost. Because the clapping was too strong, too real, too full of emotion to ignore. People weren't just cheering, they were standing. The audience rose, one person after another, until the entire room seemed to be lifted on its feet. But Mark didn't look at them. He kept his eyes down, staring at his own trembling hands. They didn't feel like his hands. They felt like the hands of the boy he once was, the boy who used to dream big, who used to believe that music could change his life. A part of him wondered if this moment was real, or if he had simply fallen asleep from exhaustion and started dreaming. When he finally dared to look up, he saw faces, so many faces staring at him with surprise, admiration, even shock. He saw a woman wiping tears from her eyes. He saw a man recording the moment with shaky hands. He saw teenagers whispering to each other with expressions that said, asterisk, how did we not know? Asterisk, but the person who caught his attention the most was Lily. She was standing in her little spot off stage, clapping harder than anyone else in the room, her entire face glowing with pride. She didn't look shocked. She didn't look surprised. She looked like she already knew this truth. Her father wasn't just a janitor. He was someone special. As soon as his eyes met hers, tears slipped down her cheeks. Not tears of sadness, tears of joy. She mouthed the words, "You did it," and that simple moment almost broke Mark completely. His chest tightened with a powerful rush of emotion, the kind that made it hard to breathe. Backstage, performers who had been preparing for their acts now stood crowded together, whispering in awe. A dancer said softly, "I didn't know he could play like that." Someone else murmured, "That wasn't practice. That was soul." Even the stage manager, who was known for being strict and impatient, leaned against the wall with watery eyes, whispering, "Where has he been hiding that?" The director of the showcase, Mrs. Grayson, stepped forward slowly, looking as though she had just witnessed a miracle. She had been in the back trying to fix the schedule when she heard the first notes of Mark's unexpected performance. At first, she thought it was a recording playing by mistake. But when she realized where the sound was coming from, she rushed toward the stage and stopped in her tracks in pure disbelief. Now she approached him carefully, as though she were afraid she might startle him back into hiding. Mark stood from the bench, unsure of what to do next. He felt out of place again, awkward, like he didn't belong in the center of so much attention. He opened his mouth to say something, to apologize maybe, or to explain, but no words came out. His throat felt tight. The applause slowly softened as people settled back into their seats, still buzzing with excitement. It wasn't just admiration. It was astonishment. They had come for a talent showcase, expecting to see young performers and beginners, but instead they had witnessed something rare. Something that felt honest and powerful. One woman near the front leaned toward her friend and whispered, "How many years has that man been cleaning this place? And we never noticed him." Her friend whispered back, "We never asked. Maybe we should start seeing people." Those words reached Mark's ears, and he felt something unexpected, a strange warmth. A feeling of being seen for the first time in a long time. Mrs. Grayson stepped forward and said in a calm but emotional voice, "Excuse me, sir. Do you have a moment?" Mark blinked in confusion. "Sir?" Nobody called him that here. People usually called him, "Hey," or "Excuse me," or sometimes nothing at all. He nodded slowly, unsure what was happening. The director smiled, but her eyes were still wet. "That was breathtaking," she said softly. "We had no idea you could play like that." Mark looked down, embarrassed. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't mean to interrupt the show. I only played because my daughter thought it would help fill time." Mrs. Grayson shook her head gently. "Interrupt? Mark, you didn't interrupt the show. You saved it." He had no idea how to respond. The audience burst into applause again, proving her right. Lily rushed onto the stage and wrapped her arms around him tightly. Mark hugged her just as tightly, lifting her slightly off the ground as she buried her face into his shoulder. It was the first time in years that he felt the world turning toward him instead of away. The first time he realized that maybe, just maybe, his music wasn't lost after all. And the people around him were beginning to see the truth he had tried so long to hide. This quiet single father was far more than the man who cleaned their floors. He was someone extraordinary. The applause slowly faded, but the warmth it left in the room stayed like a gentle glow. Mark was still holding Lily in his arms, her tiny arms wrapped tight around his neck. His eyes were wet, though he wasn't sure if the tears were from surprise, relief, or something deeper, something he thought he had lost forever. As he set her down carefully, the director, Mrs. Grayson, stepped forward again. She waited for the noise to settle, her expression soft but full of admiration. "Mark," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I don't know your story, but I do know talent when I see it. And what you just played wasn't ordinary. It was honest, beautiful." Mark looked at the floor, shy. He wasn't used to compliments, especially not ones that came from people who usually walked past him like he wasn't there. I don't. He began quietly, I haven't played in years. That, Mrs. Grayson replied gently, makes what you did even more remarkable. A few performers stepped closer, clapping softly as if afraid to break the moment. One young pianist, the girl who had been scheduled to perform next, looked at him with wide, star-filled eyes. I want to play like that someday, she whispered. Mark blinked, stunned. People rarely looked at him that way with respect, admiration, or interest. Mrs. Grayson glanced back at the audience, then at Mark again. If it's all right with you, she said, I'd like to offer you something. Mark felt his breath catch. Offers weren't something people usually brought to him. Problems, yes. Spills on the floor, broken lights, extra cleaning hours, yes. But offers? Never. You don't have to accept now, she continued, noticing his confusion. But I'd like to officially invite you to perform at the talent showcase. Not as a filler, not as an emergency solution, but as part of the evening's program. She paused, then added softly, you belong on this stage as much as anyone else. Mark's heart thudded. Belong? That word felt foreign to him. He had spent years telling himself he didn't belong anywhere except behind a mop, hidden in the dark corners of the auditorium. He opened his mouth to refuse. His instinct was always to say no. To shrink, to step back into the shadows. I'm not sure I can, he whispered. I mean, I clean the place. People know me as someone who has talent, the director said firmly. As someone who moved an entire room with nothing but a melody. He didn't know what to say. Just then, Lily slid her hand into his, her grip warm and confident. Dad, she said softly, you told me once that dreams don't disappear. Sometimes they just... Wait. Mark felt a sharp ache in his chest as memories of Ava came back. Her voice, her smile, the way she used to encourage him to chase music with all his heart. She had believed in him when he didn't believe in himself. And now, Lily's voice carried the same strength, the same hope. He looked at his daughter, then at the piano, and then at the director. And for the first time in many, many years, he felt something powerful rising inside him. That courage, that kind he thought he had buried long ago. I'm willing to try, Mark finally said, his voice trembling but sincere. Lily beamed, hugging his arm tightly. The director smiled warmly. Good, because I'd like to talk to you about more than just tonight's performance. Mark frowned slightly. More? She nodded. We've been searching for someone to teach beginner piano lessons at the community center's new music program. Nothing huge at first. A few classes a week. I don't know if it's something you'd want, but... She looked at him with genuine hope. I think you'd be perfect. Mark felt the world tilt. Teaching? Sharing music again? Being paid to do something he loved rather than something he tolerated. His throat tightened so much he could barely speak. I don't know what to say. Say you'll think about it, she replied softly. He nodded slowly. I'll think about it. Lily tugged on his sleeve. Dad, this is it. This is your moment. For the first time in years. Mark didn't just hear those words. He believed them. The stage lights dimmed as the show continued. But Mark didn't return to the shadows the way he once would have. Instead, he stayed near the piano, talking shyly with performers, answering questions, receiving compliments that made him blush. People saw him not as a cleaner, not as background, but as a musician, not as someone who had touched their hearts with nothing but a melody. And as he held Lily's hand, he knew the truth. Life had taken many things from him. But tonight, life had given something back, not just a moment, not just applause, a second chance, one he never thought he'd get, but one he was finally ready to embrace.